Hey everybody, welcome to Let's Play. I'm Jonathan,
And I'm Charlotte.
and today we are doing Final Fantasy tier rankings, specifically Final Fantasy stories, all the way back. I think today we're gonna probably only get to Final Fantasy 7, so we're gonna go from 16 through 7. We have our little tiers here. Number 1, all-time classic, masterpiece, can't touch it. We have amazing, can't miss. Then we have just great.
Webster's dictionary defines great.
Yeah, I was thinking about just making it as Grood, like a between good and great. Judging by your facial reactions, that was probably a good idea to not do that. Then, as the kids say, mid, pretty
Slay.
Yeah. And then we have Choco Poo or Choco Dung, which is the worst. I'm interested to see like if any go into the lower categories. So I'm a big Final Fantasy fan. And what about how would you describe your Final Fantasy fandom?
I have been a Final Fantasy fan for a long time, but I definitely have some strong opinions on some of the stories.
Nice. Well, let's get into it then. Starting off hot with the most recent one, Final Fantasy 16.
This is most recent, but somehow it's the hardest for me because I strongly feel like Final Fantasy 16 starts off so strong. The first half of the game, I feel like the narrative is great, it's compelling, but it really felt like you got to the end of Final Fantasy 16, like it's the end, wrap it up. And then I feel like the epilogue of it was just like so cheesy
Yeah.
that I'm like, there are a lot of things that it set up that I feel like it just didn't really deliver on. Okay, this is going to be a spoiler, but I always hate when it's like, oh, this is the hero's journey. We have to kill them at the end, right? That's like what's expected. And it's like,
You
why?
can't be a hero without sacrifice, Charlotte.
It was so like,
Why? Yeah, for me, there's so much about the story that I really liked. I think some of the high points, I think the core heroes in the story are all really well developed and well written, like specifically Clive, Jill, and Sid. Like, I really love that trio. And their personalities and the relationship between the three of them, I think they really do a good job of like carrying you throughout like a really long story.
which I feel like is also kind of why it does feel like it peters out at the end, because like they kind of remove Jill from the narrative,
Yeah.
and Sid understandably is not there. It was also kind of hard because I know like Final Fantasy 16 does have some of the extended narrative stuff, but I feel like they were never really upfront in the game about like, wait, so Joshua has been alive all this time, and like why has he had to be like part of a secret order and not really like cluing Clive in?
Yeah, that aspect of it, I didn't quite. I think they could have did a better job of like coming up with story reasons. For me, where it struggled was like a couple of areas. I think number one, I think this game definitely has like a villain problem, where the big bad is completely emotionless and devoid of any personality. And I think that's largely by design, because he's supposed to be this godlike figure that could care less about the squabbles of mankind, which I do understand, but the problem with that is it makes a very uncompelling characterization of the villain. And I really did not love that. And even a lot of the like lesser villains I felt were very one note. Like I forget his name, but who was like the king of like Waloed? That guy was very one note.
And that's also like, again, he's near the end of the game and you get to that kingdom and it's like, it's supposed to be this big exciting thing because like they don't have intel on that kingdom and no one really knows what's going to happen there. But you get there and it's just kind of like a bunch of empty fields and there's nothing like that shocking.
The only compelling villain for me was Benedicta, because she had personal connections to Sid and then to Clive later on, and there was like a lot of like natural tension there that I think they could have built on it. I thought they like got rid of her a little too fast.
That was how I felt too. And like even to the point where I was like, wait, did she actually just die? Because it seemed like they gave her so much like backstory and characterization, which I guess is because they were, killing her off so soon. But it's like, it felt like they weren't done with her. We weren't done with her. They like set her up as kind of, like a tragic villain. Like that's, I guess, more compelling, but also the more you learned about her, the more you're kind of like, oh, I don't feel great that we're just like, yeah, kill her.
I do like Clive's arc, but I thought pacing-wise, they maybe kind of rushed through it.
They kind of got a little too like, oh, we need to move this along, time skip. So
yeah.
It's like, I would have loved to see Clive actually, going through the struggle of, becoming the new Sid.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I felt like that time skip was not necessary. It's one thing, you have the first time skip between him, like in his normal life, and then you come back to him years later. You understand the trauma he's gone through. You like didn't really need to see that, and like that time skip works for what it is. They seem to go, oh, we can't, like it would be too weird to have him suddenly be like so established in the home base as like the new Cid. We need that time skip.
I mean, it's a little bit of a trope, but I love that aspect of like, okay, our home's been destroyed. We have to rebuild.
It was set up so much as like, oh, this is a really like hard place to live. Like we have to like work to survive here. It's like I would have liked to see some of that.
One thing I really love about the game though, because not every Final Fantasy game comes up with a good way of incorporating the summons into the narrative. Summons are in usually every Final Fantasy game, but in this one it was really done quite well. Like, I love the whole concept of, you know, you have these dominants and they're sort of like affixed to these godlike beings and they're sort of kind of royalty in a way. And I love how like if you're not like the one chosen by the dominant, you're kind of like cast aside as this like useless person.
That's interesting. And at the same time, I kind of wish we had seen it a little more, because like I feel like even with the backstory we did get for Jill, it was still just kind of like, oh yeah, she was like from another kingdom and she was sent here. And it's like, what?
Yeah, I definitely would have liked more Jill backstory, but also because I don't believe you actually go to her homeland, right? It's just sort of referenced. That would have been a cool place to visit.
And also just kind of the fact that the narrative itself kind of struggled with like, you start out and it's kind of like, oh, Clive is absorbing the dominance when people die and taking them from them. But then they very clearly got to a point where they're like, oh, but we have to take the dominance from characters that we don't want to kill off. They just never found a good way to kind of approach that.
Yeah, that's one thing that I didn't like about it too, because once you establish that as a mechanic, it sort of inadvertently makes the story a little bit predictable. Because you know, okay, eventually I'm going to have to get all these summons. I'm probably going to have to like kill that person, or something's going to happen with Jill where I have to take Shiva over.
Yeah, and it seemed like that was kind of building up to something more dramatic than it was Jill just being like, yeah, take it. I'm done.
To me, though, still very good, though. I'm mostly positive on it. Is that how you feel, or were you kind of mixed?
I would put it under great, in my opinion.
Oh my God, really? Wow, I thought this would be amazing. Interesting. Okay. I mean, I could stomach that if we want to say great.
Which, I mean, I guess, like, also, I'm very aware of the fact that I feel like a lot of 16 that I responded so well to is because 15 was not good.
That's a good point. And with that, let's talk about 15.
Bottom tier.
So you're going right to Chocopu?
Yeah.
Wow. We got to talk about it a little bit, though.
Yeah, obviously, like,
because I think I agree with you. For me, this is probably my least favorite Final Fantasy game,
and
like, easily.
It's like going into it, it has like so many tropes that I'm like interested in and that I like in these sort of narratives, but they just didn't use them in any way. I feel like the biggest misstep to me in 15 in making it like interesting is Noctis had shockingly little awareness of like his kingdom or like anything going on around him. And if you watch, you know, kind of the extended, you know, like anime episodes, that sort of thing, they kind of try to establish that as, you know, oh, he was like sent away and his dad's trying to protect him. He's trying to like not have him involved in like this terrible like crystal nonsense. But it's also like, it just feels so weird. He just never felt connected to this like kingdom that he's supposedly trying to save.
That was a problem for me. And I think a lot of it comes down to this game never really knew what it wanted to be. There's this one angle where, okay, you have this like entourage of your friends, you're going on this like fun road trip and you're kind of like playing all that up and like the kind of dynamics between everyone in the crew. And that, like, I thought that could have been cool. And I like that idea. I like the idea that, you know, you're going camping, you're cooking food, you're taking pictures with each other, you have your car. And that's like all very cool, but just didn't feel like that aspect of the story didn't vibe with the whole wayward prince of this kingdom that just got took over. And now I have to like reclaim my birthright by like going to all these sort of like random tombs to get powers. And that felt like that was shoehorned in just to fit the open world gameplay, which I didn't really think was
It was like
necessary.
Very clear, like we all know that 15 was in development forever. And like it was very clear that it was, you know, a lot of things that were kind of like pushed together to make the final game. If I was trying to fix it, rather than, you know, the kingdom falling from the very start, I would have, you know, the first half of it being kind of that like fun bachelor's party, going to like see Luna for this supposed marriage.
They could have did something where it was almost like a rite of passage where like you need to learn about your kingdom kind of thing, right? You go around, experience the world, go to all these towns, help people get into adventures, bond with your friends. And yeah, I agree. Like having the whole kingdom falling thing happen so early, it kind of derailed everything towards this, okay, now I have to like go power myself up with these magical weapons.
It's so wild how a lot of the actual plot moving forward, like Luna is doing by going to like all these summons, creatures, etc. before you get there, and you only really get to see her half of stuff when you finally get to like the town where you see her for the last time.
Yeah.
And it's like one that's like she's super underutilized as a character.
Totally.
And they put a lot of time and effort into kind of establishing the like relationship between Luna and Noctis, and then they just don't really ever use it.
Yeah, because I think another problem this game has is not necessarily the story, but how they tell it. Because there's so many, they do those like intermittent flashbacks where they're kind of like pen pals, and that kind of thing maybe would work better in a book or something. But I feel like in a game where you really just like stop momentum and you're trying to like sell to the audience that, hey, these two, they are like, even though they haven't seen each other in so long, they're kind of like a great pair and they have this dynamic relationship. But I thought like when you do get to the moment where you do see her and all the stuff goes down there, it doesn't hit as hard because you weren't as invested in her as a character, where it could have, because she is a cool character that has like an interesting backstory, but it was sort of like kept in the shadows or just like sprinkled in sort of awkward ways where
and
it didn't
like,
really resonate.
Even if you had gone with the angle, like, because I also understand they wanted it to be kind of that like boys weekend going on a trip sort of thing. And it's like, if it had been kind of angled more as like you're going on this journey to like actually go meet her to be married, and it's kind of more light fun before everything goes down, like you could have them referencing like things about her. Like she doesn't have to actively be in the party to establish kind of
And I think that goes back to not knowing what kind of game it wanted to be, because if that was your core thing, okay, we're going to like your wedding and this is the lead up to it, to me like it would have made more sense to have it be a more linear game, where especially if you're going for that like road trip angle, it doesn't make sense to like go to a town and like, oh, I'm going to spend 30 hours here just like inspecting every cave. Like that's not how road trips work, right? You're going from point A to point B to point C in somewhat of like a direct fashion. And how many gas stations are in this game? Good Lord.
It was also funny how like maybe you're trying to say something about the world where it's like none of the towns are that interesting. They're like pretty dilapidated and old.
Yeah, it was pretty boring.
But it's so funny when the time skip near the end of the game happens and you come back to the world and they're like, everything's terrible and like everything's ruined. And you're like, it looks exactly the same.
Yeah, you're damn right it is.
It's dark.
Yeah, no, I think the pacing of this game is it definitely works to its detriment, because even with the fact that obviously like the core group of friends is at the heart of the story, when you have that kind of dynamic, you want to introduce conflict so that it becomes interesting. You know, you're not just like all buddy and high-fiving each other throughout like 75% of the game. And the real like tension never really starts until like the final act, where, you know, people get hurt, people get killed, people get maimed, and it's like real like they're like at each other's throats and people don't talk to each other, and there's like really soured relationship, there's loyalty that's questioned, and like that, all that stuff gets bunched in at the end, and you can't really, I thought it would have been much better to like spread it out a little bit more, so it's throughout the story, so there's always that little bit of like tension between the members of the team.
It was also just like, I could see what they were going for, you know, after Luna dies and they have like Gladio kind of mad at Noctis for like being sad, but it's like they didn't do it in a good way. Gladio was like, Ignis lost his eyes and he's blind now, you have to take this seriously. And it's like, I mean, Noctis did just have his like very close friend like die in his arms. Like obviously you can kind of be like, hey, you need to focus on the here and now, but also like it's not like he's goofing off and be like, I'm not taking this seriously.
And I think the other problem too is like this game really relies on external media to kind of fill in the gaps. Like the DLC in this game is like really important, especially for the ones like around like the different members of your team, and even to the main villain, who I do actually like. I like the villain in this game. Arden, I think is his name.
Yeah.
But a lot of the backstory you have to wait until after you beat the game to get. And it's like, without all this chocobo nonsense and like going to all these tombs, like cut all that out and just put like the cool story stuff into the meat of the game. I thought that would have made a much better experience.
Even like Square Enix got tired of the DLCs and was like, just stop.
And there was like a comic book too, right? That you
and there was like a prequel movie, which was actually like the movie like main character was kind of much more interesting.
Oh, interesting. I like the tone of the ending and like the story beats of like kind of the themes of like sacrifice. I didn't love the time jump either. I thought that was kind of unnecessary, and they could have did kind of the same thing. But it did like hit me a little in the feels though, like towards the end, just like how they kind of like tied everything together, and especially like how it like blends into the logo. Like I thought that was really cool. So it did leave like a little bit of a warm, fuzzy feeling in me towards the very end. But I just like, to me, like this game's just frustrating because it was like so many missed opportunities. Like I really think just a few more streamlined story structure things could have really made this like one of the better ones. So what are we thinking? Choco-dung? Mid?
I mean, it's definitely Choco-dung for me.
Oh, that's rough. All right. Sorry, Noctis.
The concept of your character and your powers was cool. Next is 14, which I never got into it because I already was like a Genshin player and I didn't need 2 games that I have to do daily. But I'm pretty sure the arc of 14 as an online like story is kind of like, it didn't start out the greatest, but people have really liked some of the stuff added onto it.
Yeah, there's that whole, because when it was originally released, it was a complete disaster, and then they actually like reworked the entire game, and then it got re-released as A Realm Reborn, but that's kind of like where people, I think most players kind of started. But to me, the sad thing is I played this game for like 70 hours actually, but I can't tell you one thing about the story because I just don't like MMOs, and there was so much just like go here and give this person this herb and go here and kill that monster and hunt this and give this person some tea, and there was no story, and a lot of people tell me, you got to play for like X amount of hours before it gets good. I'm like, well, if that's the case, then you can have it, because I think once it gets into the expansions, the story gets a little bit more crystallized and concrete. But no, I mean this to me is Choco-dung City. I'm sorry. And again, it's mostly just because I just don't think a compelling narrative, a well-paced narrative, just jives with the MMO type of experience. I just think they're almost like with like an open world that's too big. It's just very hard to marry those two concepts together. It's always going to feel disjointed to me. And like, I'm not saying like if you like MMOs, like there's a way to tell stories that fit into that gameplay loop, but I think the way that they did it wasn't. For me, it didn't quite work, and it didn't resonate. So down you go, 14, and all your DLCs.
Don't complain at me. I can't help here.
All right, this next one is an interesting one.
I will also preface this with I've only played regular 13. I didn't get into any of the like 13 to 13 Lightning Returns, and I like. Well,
let's only focus on the 13.
Yeah, I know that maybe some of the narrative problems that I may or may not mention having with it here, I know some of that got addressed in the later entries, but I also know it got more and more insane, so I don't know.
Look, I'll be honest. I think 13 is a little underrated, to be honest, because a lot of people hated on it because mostly for the gameplay stuff, because they thought it was like very linear, and it took a long time to allow you to kind of really experiment with like all the different combat mechanics and like party members. But to me, like there's a lot to like about the game. I think the lore is very, very interesting. There's kind of this idea that you have like this one planet Cocoon, and then there's this other planet Pulse, which is sort of like this more primitive, like animal-like kind of environment. And
yeah, because was 13 the first of the crystal ones? Or?
Yeah.
Like
15 was supposed to be in that same universe, and that's part of the reason why it was so long in development hell.
All of the crystal stuff, I feel like I kind of appreciate their attempt to try and build out that as a concept and kind of like use that as a basis of like what they're doing. But I guess it's also maybe I feel like they might have learned the wrong lessons from 13, because I feel like 13 did very much try to tell you all about the world in the gameplay, and it's just like I feel like the lesson from there wasn't remove all that, like if people want to know it they'll look it up elsewhere. Like it was just.
This one did have, I think it was the first Final Fantasy game to have like a glossary where you can actually go in and search. And
I feel like the lesson there should have been like make this more approachable in how you're, breaking it down to a player.
Yeah, because I think one thing that sticks with me about doing it is even though I did like the broad strokes of the story, it gets very hard to follow at times. And part of that is the pacing, which I'll get into in a second. But another thing is just like, this is kind of like silly, but it's like just like the way they named certain things was like super confusing because they have like the foul C, the C, the CF, and it's just like hard. I guess you kind of needed a glossary to sort of parse that all out. But sticking with the positives for a second though, I like the idea of how you have these like ragtag group of characters that all of a sudden they're all sort of like branded with this thing that, you know, you have to, it's kind of crazy because they have to like become Ragnarok, this sort of like monster that's destined to like destroy the world or destroy a god.
Yeah, and I feel like kind of Final Fantasy up to and including 13 was kind of very much that like your party is very like, you know, they're not necessarily people who were friends before this. They're not necessarily people who like under other circumstances would be hanging out. And then it's like 15 and 16 are very much, these are established people who know each other. And it is definitely a different kind of like RPG feeling.
Yeah, and I think like getting to the pacing, that's where it suffers because it does a weird thing where in the very beginning, you know, it brings all the characters together. And then they kind of split off into like pairs or like little sub pairs, and that kind of thing is common in like television shows. If you have like watch Game of Thrones, like you have like the odd pairings, and it works in that scenario though because you can move around from like scene to scene much more briskly. Like you can have like a 5-minute scene, a 10-minute scene, but when you're playing a game, you can't do that kind of pacing. So it's like, all right, now I'm gonna spend 3.5 hours with like Lightning and Hope, and then when I'm done with that, I'm gonna jump over to like, I forget the name. I think it's like Saz and like Vanille or something like that. And then they're doing their whole thing, and it's completely separate. And by the time I finish that, I've completely forgotten what's going on with these people. And it does that like 4 different times with like 4 different groups. And yeah, it just kills the momentum of the story, I think.
And also like in a TV show, it's much easier if you're like, I don't like this specific character or like I just don't vibe with them.
Yeah, it'll be over soon.
Yeah, whereas like in gameplay, it's like if you're not enjoying playing as a certain character, then it's like it's hard to like power through a segment where you have to do that for like possibly hours.
Yeah, and you know, there's certain moments where it works, like specifically like with Lightning and Hope. I kind of like it because, you know, she's like this badass like ex-military person, and she's kind of like cold and rigid, and Hope is sort of like this idealistic like youth. He's sort of like wayward, and he's actually like looking for revenge. And in the beginning she's like, you can't come with me, you're just gonna like slow me down. But eventually like she warms up to him and she tries to toughen him up. So there's some nice like character building happening in those moments, but it just makes you lose like the larger picture of the story. And that's actually, I think, the strength of the game, like the larger story. And because of the way it's like organized and delivered to the player, I think a lot of that gets lost. So yeah, a little bit of a bummer. It's a freaking beautiful game though. My God,
Yeah.
if you watch it now on YouTube, it looks like it could have came out like last month. It's like ridiculously how good that game looks.
But yeah, I feel like as we're stacking things up here, I would probably put it in the mid. Because like
yeah,
I'm not gonna say it's like on the same level as 16.
it's definitely, yeah. See, this is where it comes into like comparing it to each other. Yeah, it's definitely below 16. I agree, but I definitely think it's worth playing though, especially if you like role-playing games. So next up we have Final Fantasy 12. So this was the last one to come out on PlayStation 2.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear your take on it because I did start Final Fantasy 12, but just like the characters weren't really doing it for me. I wasn't really having that great a time, so it was one I kind of just stopped playing.
This one has an interesting problem because the quote-unquote main character of this game virtually has like no impact on the story like whatsoever. It's this character named Vaughn, and his really only connection to like the larger plot is like his brother was in the military or in like the army, and I think like he gets killed in like the first scene, and he kind of like half blames it on one of the other characters. But it's just so frustrating because you're largely like experiencing the game through this character, and he's really just like tagging along for the ride. Yeah, it just feels sort of like off the whole time. And
yeah, like to get engaged in a story, it's like I definitely understand the mechanic and like it works when done well of a character who's, you know, kind of not like it isn't their story. They're kind of just like the vehicle for the audience to be brought into the world. But it's like in those cases, I feel like the story, the world has to be engaging enough to kind of make me, you know, want to dip into that. 'Cause it's like, if I'm not being driven by like, oh, this is an interesting main character, or this is an interesting story world.
Yeah. No, I think it is a problem for me because, you know, you want your character to have, even if they don't go through like a normal like hero's journey arc, they need to have like some agency. They need to have some impact on what's going on. Otherwise, it just feels like, you know, yeah, you're watching through someone's eyes, and you know, you don't have that initiative. And you know, some of the other characters are cool, and I do think this is like almost like a simple fix where if you just made one of the other characters like the main character, it might have worked a lot better. Because yeah, like there's a princess and she's kind of like trying to take back her kingdom. There's sort of like a hero who's sort of eventually cast as a villain, and there's like an interesting dynamic there. And his twin brother is like with the enemy, so that's kind of cool. And then there's like that thief kind of person, or the airship pirate. I forget his name. I think it's like Balthier. He has like a cool personality, and he has his own like connections to the evil empire. And yeah, like focusing on honestly like any of those characters, I think would have been a little bit more interesting. And then like Vaughn has like a friend too. I forget her name. It's like Penelope or something, and she's even more useless. Like she's just there. She doesn't do anything. She stinks in your party. Big problem.
So I guess really the question is, would you say mid? Like, is there anything that you would say is worth bringing it to that level?
See, the thing I like about this game, though, there is like a lot of nuance to the villains in the evil empire, which I do like, because, you know, there's like a big bad, but then he also has like a younger brother who's like a little bit more sympathetic to your cause. And I like that it explores like the gray areas of like villains. And it also explores the idea of like, okay, if you're taken over by a hostile entity, like what happens after that? And how do you sort of like cope with that new reality? Which I thought this did kind of investigate in a particularly interesting way. But it feels wrong to put it on the same level of 13, because I do feel like I enjoyed it more. But that might be more like the gameplay, because this did have like a really cool combat system, to be honest. But story-wise, yeah, it's probably still below.
It does say story.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry, I'm getting off topic. Is it worse than 16? Is it better than 13? I mean, yeah, I think mid's probably fair. Yeah, that's okay. All right, we'll settle on mid.
My story for 11 is I bought Final Fantasy 11 when I was a youth, and the discs came scratched. Oh. And then instead of returning it, my dad goes, "No, I can buff these out. I'm taking them upstairs." And then I never saw those discs again. So
he buffed them into oblivion.
So that's my review of Final Fantasy 11.
So this was the first online Final Fantasy game, and I did not play it because I had no idea how to even like do that when it came out. If I remember correctly, they announced 9, 10, and 11 like all at once, and because 9 was like the last PS era game, then Final Fantasy X was like the new glitzy PS2 version, and then 11 was like this new experimental thing they were doing. But for me, it always felt like a letdown, because it's like, you know, I wanted a new traditional Final Fantasy like title. So the fact that this was like this new MMO experiment, I didn't really love.
And it was like also one that was a monthly fee to play it, and just like, I wanted to experience that as, even as a kid, like if you have the money, it's like you then have to like be like, "Hey parents, can I use your credit card?"
Yeah, it's a whole thing. But I don't know anything about the story. I never played it. So yeah, this one, I guess it's probably like we just like don't rank it, right?
Yeah.
All right, we'll leave you over to the side. If you have heavy thoughts about 11, let us know. Or not. It's your world. Next one, Final Fantasy X.
10 was my first Final Fantasy that I played. And I guess like going off kind of, you know, like it's okay to have a main character who's not like the main character. Like I feel like 10 does that really well, because it's like Tidus is, you know, kind of the player's way of being introduced into like Spira, and especially like experiencing Yuna's story.
Yeah.
And I feel like it does it really well, and it's also like something that like 15 struggled with. It's like you never feel like it's like, okay, Yuna, stop doing your thing. It's time to focus on Tidus now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing that works with this game is it brings your party together early on, and they're together for like the majority of the story. And Yeah, the idea of like Yuna going through her pilgrimage, it just fits with the gameplay loop really well, as well as like, as a party, you're going from all these like different exotic locations and you have a goal in sight really the entire time. And as it gets like closer and closer, like the implications of like what you're doing become a little bit more heavier. And I think it has like a really good sense of like building up
and like you have a very like grounded in the world of the game, like why you're doing this like repetitive like game dungeon thing. And just like, again, it's also another one that has a really good like the summons are tied to like the lore.
Yes.
But it's also like I never really felt in 10 like you're getting that like, oh, you're in a new place, you're like 20 different terms you need to learn. Like I feel like they did a very good job of like Tidus is an outsider, so they have to feed that information to Tidus, but it never completely feels like, just an exposition dump.
Yeah, no. I generally like the fish out of water type mechanic. I think it could be kind of fun. And I really love like how they explain like Tidus's backstory. It's very like surreal. It's not like, oh, he's just from like another universe. It's like the way that they kind of like gradually explain that. I think it's like really, really cool. And probably like that aspect of him like makes him one of the most unique characters in Final Fantasy history.
There were earlier protagonists who, were trying to be like cool guy, but it's like Tidus is very much not a cool guy, and like I like that.
Yeah, he's kind of a dork, and but it's like endearing in a way because he's so out of place all the time, and people kind of roll their eyes at him. And seeing him like become like a more mature member of the team and like kind of coming into his own, it feels very natural and earned.
And just like we talked about, endings getting to us, like you do feel sad at the end of Final Fantasy X.
Yeah. I think one thing that this game really does well too is like within the world, there's this idea of like there's these cycles that are happening and they're kind of inevitable, right? Like sin is always going to come back and incarnate the next person, and a pilgrimage always has to happen like every so years to prevent this apocalypse, and people are always going to have to die. And I love that like feeling of inevitability and how you're like at the there are moments where like, oh, maybe we can like question this and like break apart from this.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably put 10 like amazing.
Yeah, I think definitely, yeah. And shout out to just the world design in general. It's one of the more unique Final Fantasy worlds.
And it's also like a very like the designs are cool, and it's very like there's thought put into those designs. The fact that like, oh, you have a lot of these villages because most of them don't have a chance to like grow up into big cities.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense too. And I just love like the archipelago, like tropical island kind of aesthetic that it comes throughout. What did you think about the villain in 10?
He's a creep.
For some reason, he always reminded me of Joaquin Phoenix. I think his name's Seymour, right?
Yeah, Seymour.
Yeah. Shout out to Seymour. Good drip. All right. So moving on to Final Fantasy IX. So now we're going back to the PS1 era.
And
this is my golden age.
Yeah, like 9 is one that I actually haven't played all the way through. I, in the past year, actually started it, and I really enjoyed what I did start. Like, again, it's one that I love that it's like super colorful, fun characters, and like I know it's one of the like more beloved stories out there. So it's definitely one that I want to fully experience.
I think you would enjoy it because 9 is interesting because 7 and 8 were kind of seen as like big departures from the traditional like medieval fantasy kind of setting. So a lot of people felt like 9 was like their way of like, okay, let's go back to like what made us who we are. So it has that kind of like steampunk kind of aspect to it as well, with like a lot of airships.
But I guess it's also like not exactly like that because it's kind of, I guess it's got like that like Italian-esque like and very like theater inspired.
Yes, I love the whole like theater troupe in the ship kind of setup and how you're like part of that team, and there's a lot of hijinks going on in the beginning. But yeah, like one of the aspects I love most about this game is the character Vivi. And there's a lot of story elements where, you're questioning like what your existence is and finding people that are like you and dealing with the idea that you may have like a predictable limited lifespan and how that like changes your outlook and coming to terms with that. And I just like Vivi is like such a great character. and the scenes that you like have with them, and then his like relationship with the other characters, I think they do like really, really well. And yeah, there's a lot of cool elements of the game. I like how there's a lot of antagonism between a lot of the members of the team, like specifically like Zidane, and I forget the knight's name. It's like Steiner or something.
Yeah, it's like parties are always more interesting, when everyone's not like, yay, we're friends forever. Like,
yeah, and there's a lot of like curveballs too. Like every act of the game, like some big thing happens and kind of sweeps you in another direction. And I like is it Sarah who's the princess? I think that's her name. I like her backstory too, because she's not like a traditional princess. Like they set her up as that, as like the damsel in distress, but as you kind of like kidnap her and take her into your world, like it becomes revealed that she has like a very complicated backstory that feeds into the larger elements at stake. So yeah, this is definitely one of the better ones.
Yeah, I'm like, I think the question now is just what tier are you putting it on?
It's definitely either, I don't know if I'm going masterpiece, to be honest, but great feels unfair.
Yeah.
I think is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do amazing. All right.
Me with no authority. Yeah.
All right. Final Fantasy VIII. This is
It's a weird one.
delightfully weird, though.
It succeeds in some of the weirdness. It like goes too far in some of the weirdness. It happened.
Yeah. I mean, the things that stick out for me is, first of all, it has the unfortunate task of trying to follow up Final Fantasy VII, which was like this like mega event in video game history. So that definitely hurt it a little bit. But some of the things that it does really well, a lot of like Final Fantasy games, they do that thing where you have like your party members, and there'll be moments where you explore each of those members' backstories. Like you'll go to their hometown, and then you find out like what's going on with them, and you kind of learn about them individually along the way. But what's cool about 8 is that all the characters like grew up together, and their growth is always in relation to each other. And even when you're exploring their backstories, no one's ever really singled out. It's always like in the context of the group, which I think is really unique for kind of all of the games.
Yeah, I guess like my main critique of it would be that sometimes like some of the past stuff isn't super clearly delivered. And especially because they're like the flashback sequences where you're playing as like Squall's dad.
It's I think his name's Laguna.
Yeah.
It's not his dad. It's I don't think they have any like familial relationship.
Yeah, but there's like some connection. But anyways, like those segments were never Man.
I love that. Because to me, like, it was about just, like, embracing the weirdness. Because when it happens, like, your party just, like, falls asleep. And then they just... Because it's not a narrative... Well, it's a narrative trick, but it's not, like, just, like, a flashback. It's, like, something's happening to the characters where they're actually, like, living out the flashback within the context of the game. Which I think just adds to that whole, like, what the hell is going on? Because it's not only are they, like, other people, but it is going back in time. And I kind of like how the game, like, throws everything at you. Like, you're like space traveling, there's time travel, there's like sorceresses that are like assuming different identities, and then you have like the whole like childhood friends element too. There's just like a lot going on. And then there's like the whole idea that you're like in this military academy, and there's other academies throughout the world, and they're kind of like rivals with each other. There's a lot going on in this game.
Yeah, I guess like for me, I would probably say I'd put it great. Like I just feel like it doesn't ever quite reach the like narrative cohesion that I enjoyed in other Final Fantasies.
Yeah.
Like it's trying out a lot of things, but like not all of them are landing.
Yeah, because when I try and remember this game, I remember like the big moments, but I can't remember it in like a linear fashion of like this happened and that happened like I can the other games. And I think that's partially why it's a little convoluted. But
yeah,
shout out to it for really being the first Final Fantasy game that has like a real romance at its core, which I thought was cool. What did you think about the whole like Squall as like this introvert, eventually kind of like coming into his own type of arc? I dug it. All right. So this next one, I'm cheating a little bit, but I don't care. This is a Final Fantasy Tactics. Gameplay-wise, it was a little bit different. It was more of like a turn-based kind of like tactical strategy kind of game. But I wanted to shout it out because this has like one of my favorite Final Fantasy stories of all time. But I just love how it's it's probably the most grounded kind of story where there are fantastical elements, but it's really like in the weeds of, government intrigue, and, your character's like part of this like big royal family, and you're sort of like the forgotten one in that whole dynamic. Like, 'cause I think one of your brothers is like this established general, another one might be like a prince or some like high authority in the kingdom, and you're kind of just this squire that has to like make their own way. And I really like that framing, and it has like a lot of that Game of Thrones type of plotting and conspiracies going on behind the scenes, and like different factions like warring with each other, and just like a lot of like complexity and like more of like the military engagement and the relationships between kingdoms and stuff that I thought was really kind of ahead of its time for this kind of era.
Yeah, so I have only played Tactics Advance, which is
It's the same thing, yeah, I think.
I'm pretty sure it's a different story. Tactics Advance was like a really weird one because it's very like removed kind of from the Final Fantasy world. Like, it was very much about kids, and like the main character comes from like the real world and goes to like the Final Fantasy world.
Oh yeah, no, that's not at all in this one.
Yeah.
Okay. The last thing I'll say about the story that I think is really cool is that the framing of like the narrator, you're kind of being told the story by like a historian, and he's like recounting these events of this like not mythical, but like big like historical war that happened between these two factions. And Delita, who's a non-playable character, he's kind of like the hero of the story throughout history, and everyone knows who he is and the deeds that he did. And the character you play, I think it's Ramses or Ramza, and you're sort of like the one has more of a impact on the story and how things played out, but for whatever reason you were like forgotten by history. It's very cool. It's very like mature too. There's a lot of like killing and death and betrayals that happen. It's like, to me, this goes in the masterpiece. Do you have any objections?
Do what you must.
You should play it though. I mean, I think you would love it. This definitely feels like it's ripe for a remake, because they did remake Tactics Ogre, I think, somewhat recently, and that was by it has like very much the same aesthetic and gameplay mechanics as Tactics, so definitely something that I think people are clamoring for.
I think the last one that we are going to cover in this episode, I mean, we all know where it's going, but we can...
No. One of the reasons why this is sort of like a landmark moment in like the Final Fantasy history is that I think they really like jumped into like new territory with the setting and sort of like the style of storytelling. Because again, even though like other games, they do mix in some other genres, like there's steampunk, there's airships mixed with like, the knights and swords and shields and castles and that kind of thing. But this one like really goes into another direction where I would probably say it's more in the cyberpunk genre, where like instead of an evil empire, you have this like mega corporation.
And it's like very kind of like ahead of its time in that like environmental angle.
Yeah. And that's like very relevant today. I think at the time when this story came out, people were more concerned with like deforestation and like the ozone layer and stuff like that.
But yeah, I feel like it was like my elementary school generation that was like, yeah, you guys are going to save the rainforest.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that angle too, because obviously like save the world is kind of a trope in these types of stories, but this game does like a really cool thing where it makes the planet kind of like a character that you have to sympathize with, the fact that it's like kind of like this living life force, and it's directly connected with all the other living beings, and like the act that the energy's being sucked out is like really hurting the planet in like a visceral way. I thought that was like such a clever kind of mechanic to make you like really invested in like the whole save the world trope.
And also, like, something I very much enjoy about like Final Fantasy VII as a story is the fact that like this is even bled over into like kind of the public concept of him. That Cloud is like this cool, brooding dude, when it's like the entire like story is that like that's not him. That's like a persona that he took on, and like that is not his identity.
Yeah, but it's cool because even with him like assuming another personality, there is like an interesting arc going on where in the beginning of the game, he's very cold. He's like this calculated, cold mercenary, and he's working with these, environmental terrorists, I guess, for lack of a better word. And gradually over time, like he starts to like soften up to them, and then he starts to kind of like have his own identity and have his own like ambitions with how he wants to kind of impact the world.
And I feel like it especially is a game that, as we all know, like handles character depth really well, in that like even like on a story level, it's like a death that like is very much felt and reacted to by the party. But it's also like gameplay wise, it's like people were upset that they lost the equipment that they had.
You feel it, yeah.
And it's like, it's great to be like pulling kind of that narrative experience on all levers, and you never felt like it was like, oh, they just put this death in to be shocking.
Yeah.
And I feel like, there's that kind of with like the remake, Rebirth, everyone's like, what are they gonna do?
Yeah, that's a whole other thing we could talk about. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much great iconic stuff. Like, because when I think about this game, there's just like so many like pitch perfect like moments with the way they do like the whole flashback with like Cloud and Sephiroth and Nibelheim and how that's all handled. Like, it's really like a movie with the way like the atmosphere is, and it's like he's recounting the story in like the hotel room, and it's like raining, and people are kind of confused by what he's telling them, and it's like very mysterious.
It's a well done moment when like Tifa's like, hey, it didn't happen like that.
What is happening? And I think like the characters in this game are so like, this game like understands its characters so well, and there's so many elements to why they're compelling. I think it's part of it is because like it takes your traditional fantasy like archetypes and it puts like a little bit of a spin on them, or puts them in sort of unexpected scenarios. Because you have like Eris, and she's sort of the traditional white mage who heals the party, but she's very, she's like kind of spunky, and she has like an attitude.
Yeah, like that's another thing that like she kind of gets, in the public concept, she kind of gets like that Flanderization of like, oh no, she's like this sweet, kind-hearted, and that's her.
She's not, yeah.
And then I feel like Square Enix kind of like saw people take only that away from her, and then like kind of did that for other female characters down the line.
Yeah.
And it's like she was interesting because she was more than just that.
Yeah, totally. And then it kind of flips it too with Tifa, because Tifa is like, she's like the fighting monk, so you expect her to be like more of a badass and edgy, but she's probably has more of like the heartwarming, sympathetic kind of like moral center of the group. Yeah, and it's just cool. And even like a character like Yuffie, think like ninjas are usually these like stoic, quiet, mysterious characters, and she's like this like petulant, acting out teenager.
And I mean, also just like it was a fun game in that you do have those kind of like optional to find party members.
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
it
there's
says
a lot of
something about
mystery.
your characters when like people are actually going to the effort of being like, I want to go find that additional party member.
Yeah, there's a lot of mystery baked into not only like secrets in the game, but just in terms of like understanding the world. Because even with like Cloud and Zack's backstory, like that whole section is like an optional cutscene where they really like flesh things out. I know, remember you have to like go back to like a particular location like way back in the later part of the game, and then it just has this like really long cutscene.
Which, I mean, also speaking of, if it was on this list, the like original Crisis Core, I feel like I would probably put in like the great section, just because like I really like some of the major story elements that they did there, but there was also a lot of like weird like
Yeah.
The Final Fantasy VII tie-in content when you got into like Advent Children, that sort of era, that was a weird time.
Yeah. And I think this game handles villains very, very well, because obviously like Sephiroth is like this big iconic villain, but what I think it also does well is there's just as much complexity and diversity in the cast of villains as there is in the heroes, which is kind of rare, because like you have like everyone in Shinra, which has like your typical corporate structure, and yeah, you have like your president, the vice president, and then there's like individual personalities in like the weapons division, or like the urban development one who's like more sympathetic to you, and then there's the one who's like only obsessed with like security. But then you have like the Turks, and they're sort of like the CIA kind of espionage, like intelligence agency, and they're also like a little bit more like sympathetic to you, and they have a little bit more of a like a simpatico relationship, and there's really very little like straight black cat kind of villains in the game.
I kind of like, I would love to see Final Fantasy return to kind of that like a story feels more real and serious when not everything is serious. Like even just like, I feel like one of the classic things of Final Fantasy VII is it's like, oh, you can choose to like fight your way through some enemies in the Shinra building, or you can go up a lot of flights of stairs.
Yeah. The game's very funny, and there's just like little moments that the game's never afraid to kind of break away from the serious tone and just kind of have fun.
Again, like the specific elements of the world were like presented very easy to understand. It's like you it's very easy to like wrap your head around. Like, oh, the ancients, like they have this connection to the earth, okay, or whatever you want to refer to the planet as. And then even just like Shinra, it's very easy to understand because you're like, oh, a corporation. Like, yeah, it has all these specific things about it, but like it is comprehensible and it's easy to remember it. It's like we remember these words.
Totally. And and just like the fact that like Shinra is like one main villain, and when you start the game you kind of think that that's like the main villain, but then once Sephiroth is introduced, like he's antagonistic towards Shinra too, so there's like this cool triangle of like villainy happening that's always at play throughout the game. And I mean, there's just so much you could say about it. It's just like such a great game, and I love the ending too. I think it's like really, really cool, pitch perfect, and also just like the way it's delivered in this like long, kind of like operatic cinematic.
Yeah,
it's just like it's pitch perfect. So this is above Midnight. It's definitely in the top tier. Yeah,
I mean, really, I'm like, what would I complain about? The motorcycle mini game was a little weird.
I dug that. The snowboarding was hard. So look, everything we got two. I know, that's impressive. I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, I honestly I accept it.
Yeah. So obviously we don't have time to go through every single Final Fantasy game, but if you really like this format and you want us to go through, I guess 6 through 1 and keep going with this list, give us a like, give us a comment, subscribe to the channel, and we might do that if we get enough requests. And we'll make Charlotte go back and play all the old Nintendo, Super Nintendo games.
God, you'll never see me again.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care.